here, and my name is Jason James, and I'll just briefly introduce our speaker, and then we'll go straight into today's topic. So, today we have with us Mariko Togashi, and she is Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy at IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and she's been here in London for about a year. And she has worked in a variety of think tanks on subjects mostly related to security and defense, and Japan, I think it's fair to say. A bit of time in Washington, D.C. Previously was working for the Asia Pacific Initiative in Tokyo, which is now part of International House of Japan. And if you go back further, was a technology sector analyst in banking. And she also has an MA from the States in Strategic Studies and International Economics from Johns Hopkins. So, I think that's enough introduction. I'll pass over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Jason, for your kind introduction. As he introduced, I'm Mariko Togashi, a research fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy at the IISS. And thank you very much for coming tonight, and it's my great pleasure to be here. Today, I'd like to talk about Japan's economic security and the global competition and semiconductors. Here's my talking points. I will start with covering the strategic importance of semiconductors and the global competition, and then explain where Japan fits in the global landscape and what Japan is doing right now in this field. I will then put the semiconductor industry and in the policy context into broader context of national security strategy as well. And I also touch on what the new security strategy means for Japan's economic security. And I'll close my presentation with some challenges ahead. Right, so I'm sure many of you are more than familiar with this topic, but so what is semiconductor? Semiconductors are used in everyday electronic appliances, essential to our daily lives, in smartphones, computers, cars, robotics, you name it, but it's not only essential because it's in the defense systems, but it's also used in everyday lives. And as you can see, the market is set to grow, to double in the next 10 years. So semiconductors are critical to national security, not only because, like I said, I just rambled, but it's in everyday life, as you can see. And so the product that uses semiconductors is increasing, but we need to understand the semiconductor per same machine, for example, smartphone, is increasing too. So the growth is accelerated. The semiconductor industry is unique in a way that strong players in each level of the supply chain are concentrated in specific region or countries. As you can see in this chart, I'm sorry it's a little bit small, but in chip designing and logic chips, the US is dominant, which is shown in this navy bar. And in memory chips in East Asia and in light pink. In this case, Korea is dominant, and Japan is in the materials and wafer fabrication, East Asia is again dominant, but here Japan is the main players. So the industry has limited players, but each phase has different winners. So it is actually a mutually dependent industry. So, and driven by the rising US-China tension and the global shortage of semiconductors, of course worsened by the pandemic, many countries started focusing on semiconductors as strategic goods and started growing their own industrial base and also started partnering with like-minded countries. And of course, the biggest challenger to the status quo is China. China is trying to build the domestic industry under Made in China 2025. And so far, China has built up the capacity, but not for the advanced chips. And it still relies on foreign technology for those advanced areas. But what is interesting in this competition is that it is not only between China versus like-minded countries, but it's also among the like-minded countries as well. You can see, for example, Japan will have TSMC. I'll touch on this later as well, but Micron, Western Digital. US will have TSMC, Samsung, and Germany will have Intel, Wolfspeed. So it is about among like-minded countries as well. So going back to Japan's position in the semiconductor industry, Japan used to produce more than half of the global chips in the 1980s. However, Japan's position has declined rapidly, as you can see in the left-hand chart. Sorry, it's in Japanese, but it's the chip production from 1985 to 2030, this side being the forecast. However, this, I think, doesn't necessarily mean that Japan lost its position completely in the industry. As I briefly touched at the previous slide, Japan still is a key global player in material and semiconductor production equipment. The right-hand chart shows the market share of semiconductor production equipment by each process. Japan is shown in light blue. And Japan holds 30% of the global market share in production equipment. So Japan is still strategically indispensable in this industry. And currently, Japan is putting a lot of effort and money into the semiconductor industry. To build domestic industrial base, Japan has made a lot of investment decisions, not only for Japanese companies, but also for foreign companies, including 19 billion yen for TSMC's R&D center in Tsukuba, and 400 billion yen for TSMC's Kumamoto plant with Sony and Denso. And around 93 billion yen for Western Digital with Kioxia, which is a local player. It used to be part of Toshiba, and 46.5 billion yen for Micron Technology. And another pillar in Japan's semiconductor policy is, of course, the US-Japan collaboration. In April 2021, under the US-Japan Competitive Resilience Partnership, CORE partnership framework, both countries agreed on cooperation in sensitive supply chains, including semiconductors, to make them more resilient. And concrete steps were taken since then. So in May 2022, Japan then Economic Minister Haguda visited the US and conferred Japan-US cooperation toward economic security, and had meetings with companies such as IBM directly. And in July 2022, so last July, the first ever Economic 2+2, I know many of you are familiar with it, where State Secretary, Commerce Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and METI Minister attended all together, was held, and in the meeting, both countries agreed to establish a new joint research center to develop 2-nanometer chips. And another recent big initiative of Japan in this field is the creation of Rapidus, which is aimed to become a national champion of cutting-edge semiconductor, mainly currently focusing on 2-nanometer and beyond logic chips. Rapidus is a joint venture created by 8 Japanese companies: Toyota, Denso, NTT, Sony, NEC, Kioxia, SoftBank, and MUFG. Japanese big companies. They all invested, and the government put in 7 billion yen for the creation of Rapidus as well. So Rapidus plans to set up a prototype production line for 2 nanometers by the first half of 2025, and it is planned to start mass production by 2027. And it is partnering with IBM and also IMEC from Belgium. And if this succeeds, Japan's capacity to mass produce chips will jump from 40 nanometers to 2 nanometers. So this is actually a few generations jump. Whether Japan will succeed or not, we can probably talk about it later, but that's what Japan is working for right now. And also the Leading Edge Semiconductor Technology Center, it's LSTC right there, will be running the R&D function of Rapidus, which is made of research institutes and universities. So there's a lot going on to revive the semiconductor industry in Japan. But where does this fit into Japan's economic security and the broader national security strategy? So Japan has been bolstering its economic security effort in the past few years. As you can see, in 2020, Tokyo added the economic division in the National Security Secretariat, and in 2021, the Kishida administration created the first ever economic security ministerial position. And last year, the Economic Security Promotion Act passed, and this year it is said that another law with security clearance system will be discussed and hopefully passed. I will touch on the Economic Security Promotion Act a little more because it has been probably one of the biggest steps for Japan's economic security. The Promotion Act has 4 pillars. The first pillar is strengthening supply chains. This is to support the procurement of strategic products through subsidies, low interest loans, and other support. And the second pillar is security of core infrastructure, so which allows Tokyo to screen the equipment that core infrastructure companies use to mitigate the risk of cyber attacks. And the third pillar is promoting public-private cooperation and advanced technology. This is to promote public-private R&D cooperation and emerging technologies, such as AI and quantum. And the final pillar is a patent non-disclosure system to protect sensitive technologies. These measures are certainly necessary, but Japan does not see these are sufficient in shaping Japan's economic security policy. And just to go back a little bit, so although it's been a while since Japan's been making a lot of effort in this economic security field, it's actually the first time that Japan defined economic security in the National Security Strategy that came out last December. And the National Security Strategy defines economic security as to ensure Japan's national interests such as peace, security, and economic prosperity by carrying out economic measures. So that was the very first official definition. But I would say globally, even though economic security has been the major issues around the globe, there's not necessarily a consensus among countries, and even within one country, I don't think there's an exact consensus. So it's in the making, I would say. And I also want to cover what the new national security means for Japanese economic security. First of all, like I said, the document defined the term, so that's one, of course, but it has also dedicated section on economic security, which lays out a concrete agenda such as security clearance system. But above all, what I think is the biggest fruit of the document is that the concept of economic security is actually ingrained in the entire document, in security threat section and interest section, and the concept has been elevated to, the economic security concept has been elevated to the national security concept, and it showed the link between defense and the broader national security picture. And semiconductors are one of the main focus in economic security, and under the Economic Security Promotion Act supply chain pillar that I explained earlier, Tokyo designated semiconductor and 10 other items as strategically critical material in the Economic Security Promotion Law Act. And this means that a company who creates a plan to provide a stable supply of designated goods and obtain certification from, in this case, of course, METI, it can receive subsidies, low interest rate loans, and other supports. So there is, excuse me, a lot of, like I explained, there's a lot of initiatives, thoughts, and money going into this economic security. and semiconductor policy in Japan. But just to conclude, I'd like to discuss a few challenges ahead. This is not obviously the only challenges, but these are I think the big challenges that I think Japan is facing now, and potentially some suggestions as well. The first challenge is a prioritization. And this is, to be frank, not the area that Japan has been strong at. Which area to support, which industry to support first of all, and Japan has been, yes, designated a few sectors and industries, but then even within that sector, which exact technology they're investing matters a lot. So prioritization is the key, and that I think is the key point, that how Japan is going to differentiate this economic security initiative from the good old or bad old industrial policy in the past. So I think, and for this, I think another level of public-private cooperation is a must, because the main players in the economic security field is companies. I'll touch this later, but so I think this public-private cooperation and conversation is critical to have the right prioritization for Japan to achieve successful economic security policy. The second challenge is the cooperation with the like-minded countries. Cooperation with like-minded countries is not easy in the economic security field, and I think that's the biggest difference between hardcore security and economic security field, because industrial strength, weaknesses, and exposure, industrial structure, they're all different. And I think the most recent and good example is the current negotiation among the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. After the US's comprehensive ban on excuse me, advanced technology export to China, and which was announced last October, the US is pushing Japan and the Netherlands to follow the same level of restrictions against China. But for example, the Netherlands was initially openly resisting the US call to ban more chip making equipment sales to China. And the EU was also saying that it will not follow the US policies. In Japan too, although there was no official statement, has not been able to follow US policy on this front yet. And I think this is a great example that shows how difficult it is to agree on the measures when it comes to economic security. Now, although the US, Japan, and the Netherlands do agree on the necessity to deter China, but since, like I said, what they have to sacrifice or willing to sacrifice is different to take the same measure, it is simply not easy to follow. And this can easily be the case for other sectors as well, not just semiconductors. And the third challenge is to keep the innovation, industrial strength, and economic growth going. This may sound very basic, but I think in the economic security field, we tend to focus on how we can hamper the technology enemies' growth, and using their choke points. And to be fair, it is critically important, I believe, to ensure that all countries abide by the rules, but it is genuinely important to keep your own competitiveness in technology and industry and economy as well. For example, like in 5G competition, US-China competition in Southeast Asia, many Southeast Asian countries had to choose China just because it was cheap. Some countries don't have luxury to choose depending on their like-mindedness, and I think that is tied well to the global South argument. But and it is not actually fair to compare their products, because if one product have a lot of public money in it, is it reasonable for countries in like-minded countries to make the same cost structure? It's not fair. That comparison is not necessarily fair. But my point is that it is true that we have to have the competitiveness up to the level of the alternatives. And what worries me in this, when I think about this, is that of course, I think it is important for us to have this semiconductors production back to our soil, but then that also means that you are locking in the less cost-effective plant. That's why we need a lot of subsidies. And of course, security is important, but I think as much as security is important, striking the right balance is also important, because that plant, that fab that you spent a lot of money on, it's not even if you say, okay, this 2 nano or 20 nano, it didn't work well, it will be still there. You kind of just cut loss. The less cost-effective plant will be there, so you have to do something with it. So my point is that I think it is critically important for us to find the right balance and then invest in the right technology. So it actually goes back to the prioritization, but it's related. And the final point, it's actually not in these bullet points, but is that for economic security policy to succeed, as in like striking the right balance between market efficiency and security, I think companies have to be proactive actors. And many Japanese companies take the stance of just observing or being neutral when it comes to security or politics. And I think this used to be the right course of action when the politics and economy was completely separate. Japan used the term seikei bunri, which means to separate politics and economy in China policy. But in the era of geoeconomics, this separation is becoming more and more difficult. And therefore, whether geoeconomics, so whether the companies like it or not, for them to advocate for themselves is actually a national interest. So the government's job is to create that sense and the environment for the companies to be able to speak about their cutting-edge technology. And this is not necessarily easy from business perspective, because no one wants to talk about their company's secret, because that's their source of growth. But I think for the government to create that and that sense is their job. So overall, I think Japan is on the right track. But I think I just use a lot of time using the challenges. So I think Japan is at the very early stage. So whether Japan can overcome these hurdles is still remain to be seen.